problem, I think, with that logic is that once the electorate looks more like Iowa than New Hampshire, that's also pretty good news for Donald Trump, not just Ron DeSantis. So if Trump continues to win majorities in these primaries, I think it's going to be hard to justify staying in.
Welcome to The Debrief, where we talk with the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the headlines they're covering and where the story's going next. I'm Sarah Bedford, and I'm here with executive editor of the magazine, Jim Antle. And Jim, the New Hampshire primary is coming up this next week. Will the results have any meaning, or has Donald Trump basically already won the primary?
Well, a lot depends on what kind of resistance Nikki Haley can put up. She is the second place candidate in most polls. There was the hope, I think, for the Haley campaign that they can beat Donald Trump there with an infusion of independent voters. Chris Christie has dropped out of the race, and he was taking a lot of the anti-Trump Republican vote in that state, can now go to her. Ron DeSantis has stayed in the race, so Trump may not be able to consolidate all of that support, although he does now have the Ramaswamy voters. But the two polls that have been released most recently ahead of the primary show Trump hovering around 50% and still with a pretty commanding lead. So a lot is riding on what Haley is going to be able to do in New Hampshire.
What do you think happens to DeSantis after what is shaping up to be a third place finish? The polls indicate that could be the case. Is it time for him to get out after that, and will that have any effect for Nikki Haley or Donald Trump?
Well, a lot depends on how long he's going to be able to raise money to keep the campaign going. I think what DeSantis and his backers are hoping is that after New Hampshire, the primary electorate is going to start to look a lot more like it did in Iowa as opposed to in New Hampshire, where you have all of these independents, where you have a lot more centrist Republicans, and where maybe anti-Trump sentiment and anti-conservative sentiment can actually do reasonably well in a primary. The problem, I think, with that logic is that once the electorate looks more like Iowa than New Hampshire, that's also pretty good news for Donald Trump, not just Ron DeSantis. So if Trump continues to win majorities in these primaries, I think it's going to be hard to justify staying in.
So now that Donald Trump is looking more and more like potentially a presumptive nominee, there's a lot more conversations about who will be his running mate. Obviously not going to be Mike Pence again.
No.
What does he need in a VP pick this time around?
Well, he's going to be term limited to one term in office because he's already served a previous term. So you're going to need somebody who could serve as president. Now, that's true of any vice president, but I think it's particularly true when you're talking about an older president who also can't run for re-election. So this person would be positioned to be the nominee, presumably, in 2028. So that's a consideration. So you want somebody who can govern. You also want somebody who could potentially add things to the ticket in terms of appeal to voting blocs where maybe the former president isn't quite as strong. So he picked Mike Pence in 2016 because he wanted to firm up his support with evangelicals, didn't have the strong social conservative credentials he developed in his term yet. So Pence helped out in that area. A weakness for Trump has been suburban women. It was the difference maker between 2016 and 2020. So perhaps a woman governor, somebody like Kristi Noem, might be looked at as an attractive possibility.
And finally, it's shaping up to be, once again, a contest between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Right. If we do see that rematch, is it going to be the same, or is this just a fundamentally different race 4 years later and a pandemic no longer the backdrop?
Well, Joe Biden certainly hopes it's going to be the same and that it's going to be the same outcome. And, Biden and Trump, I would argue, are the two most resilient people in American politics, and both of them have been counted out many times. Both of them have been president. One of them is likely to become president again. So I think the hope for the Trump campaign is that there will be more focus on the economy, and Biden will now have a presidential record, some of which doesn't compare that favorably to Trump's. So they're hoping that the voters, particularly the voters who dislike both candidates, who skewed for Biden in 2020, that they'll break for Trump in 2024. And that's what it's looking like in the early polls, but it is, again, very early.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for being here today. You can get more writing from Jim and the rest of the commentary team at washingtonexaminer.com.